as you're entering the scene and looking at the people, also make sure you look for potential weapons that are present. And it's not just the obvious things like a gun lying around or a knife lying around. I mean, lots of things can be used against you as weapons. There's lots of things, for instance, that can be used as bludgeons. Books and chairs and beer bottles and hockey sticks. Lots of things can be picked up and used to hurt you very severely. So just be aware of those as you're doing your scan, both when you first enter a scene and when you're working on the patient and looking around, taking in the scene as it changes. In addition, there are lots of common items that we're going to show you in the next few slides that can be modified as weapons. Things can be made into knives or even zip guns. Now, we're going to show you some of these in the next couple of slides, but your local police department should have a collection of these that they've taken off of people over the years. And if you want to amuse yourself, go over there sometime or have them come down and give you a little presentation about the interesting weapons they've taken off of people. Here you see pen knives. You've probably seen these on the internet, but by the way, all these things we're talking about can be bought easily these days over the internet and just back to lots of stores in regular towns. Pen knives, hairbrushes that have been modified as to conceal a dagger, lipstick containers that have been modified to hold a knife, lighters, cigarette lighters that look like ordinary cigarette lighters. In fact, they work, but when you press the button, you get a little stiletto blade shooting up. Lots of things can be used as brass knuckles. Anything that can be put over the knuckles and used to hurt somebody with, to hit somebody with, can make a very formidable weapon, particularly if they are spiked, as you see here. Coins have been modified to include little knives. Keychain knives, you've actually probably seen these, but these can hurt you pretty badly. Twine cutters, a lot of workmen use these in the packaging business. Belt buckles can be made to conceal knives, and these are widely sold these days. Lots of little push daggers can be concealed on common items. Even the old sword cane and umbrella cane, these things are pretty easy to find on the internet. If you want to buy one, it's not that hard. We're now getting to a little mini magnite, a little flashlight that's been modified as a zip gun. These small caliber guns, as you see in this slide, can be concealed just about anywhere, and you wouldn't necessarily notice them if you're doing a quick scan, but just be aware that just because you don't see a gun around, there could easily be a gun around. So there are weapons in your environment to a far greater degree than you assume. So as you're looking around, just be aware that things may not be what they seem, and just because you don't see a weapon doesn't mean there aren't weapons there, weapons that can hurt you. Bottom line here is the thing to remember is lots of people go around armed deliberately. There are lots of weapons that people can arm themselves with in your environment, and the chances of you encountering somebody armed, either the patient or bystanders, is pretty high. One weapon we didn't mention earlier is pepper spray. Now that's not going to really hurt you badly, but it's going to disable you considerably. You don't want to be pepper sprayed on the job. So be aware that many of the people you encounter every day, many of the people you're working on, many of the people that are around the people you're working on are armed. If you suspect someone's armed, or even if you know they're armed, the thing to keep in mind is that in order to use their weapon, they have to access it. So if you suspect they're armed, make sure you watch the hand that's going to access the weapon if you've made a decision to stay there. Most people are right-handed. Most people access their weapon with their dominant hand. And the way to tell what someone's dominant hand is that most people will wear their watch on their non-dominant hand. So if you suspect someone is armed, and like me, he's right-handed, you can tell that by the watch on my left hand, then just watch my right hand if you're not sure what I'm going to do, but you've made the decision to stay there anyway. As you're doing your scan of the people present to quickly see if they might be carrying a weapon or not, well, you want to look in the places where weapons are most normally carried. For most people, the waistband is going to be the place where they carry a weapon, whether it's a gun or a knife or even a bludgeon. Pants pockets or coat pockets are probably the second most likely place, so check there for bulges. Particularly pay attention if they're padding those pockets or have their hands in their pockets. It's kind of unlikely that a bad guy's going to be carrying a gun on their ankle, but if they do, it's probably on the non-dominant ankle, which probably means the left ankle for most people. And most bad guys don't carry holsters if they have a gun, because they want to be able to ditch their firearm in a hurry and not have any trace on them that they were carrying a gun, because it's probably illegal for them to be carrying a gun because they don't have a permit or they're a felon. So holsters aren't going to be a real giveaway for bad people with firearms, but bulges in the locations we mentioned could be. If someone is carrying a weapon, they're probably going to be constantly touching it or doing something to alert you to the fact that it's there. They could be reflexively touching it to just make sure it's still in place. I mean, you see people that aren't used to carrying weapons touching it all the time just to confirm that it's there. They could be doing repeated adjustments of it because it's uncomfortable, particularly if they're on a stretcher. You know, you're not used to having a gun in your waistband lying down. So if you've got a patient that's doing that, take note and see if they have a gun there. They might have their arm held closely on their weapon side, trying to conceal the fact that there's a gun here or hold the gun in place. When they're confronted or when they're challenged or when you go to talk to them, they might turn the weapon side away, and that kind of turn away coupled with one of those other behavioral cues might give you reason to believe that they're carrying a weapon. And if they're running, if they're active, they're probably holding on to their weapon because, as we mentioned, bad guys don't use holsters. So they have to make sure the gun doesn't fall out of their waistband or their pocket or wherever they're carrying it when they're running. So all those behavioral indicators will let you know that a weapon might be present. Now, just because some people don't exhibit these behaviors obviously doesn't mean they're not armed. I mean, you can be armed to conceal it very well. And also, just because you see something like a protrusion in the waistband, which could indicate a weapon, could also indicate a cell phone, an MP3 player, or I guess some people these days still carry pagers. A shirt, a baggy shirt worn outside the pants, I mean, a lot of people do that these days, but clearly that's a dress that's going to conceal a weapon better than something that fits a little more firmly. A jacket that swings unnaturally is a sign of something heavy in the pocket, so give that a little more attention. And when I say give it a little more attention, what we mean is just say to yourself, that person might be armed. Maybe I ought to give that person just a little more more of my time, more of my attention than I would normally. So when I get my head up and I'm looking around, I'm paying a particular attention to what that guy is doing, as opposed to, you know, the little old grandmother over here who's obviously concerned about her child. Even if you know your way around firearms, it's not a good idea to try to do anything more if you have to remove a firearm from someone than to simply grasp it very safely at the bottom part of the grip, remove it. Don't try to unload or do anything else to it, and simply put it into a lockbox just the way it is. And then your policy takes over from there. And of course, you're probably going to be telling the police at some point too. But don't try to manipulate this gun, even if you think you know what you're doing. Even if you, in fact, you know what you're doing. Just take it out, put it in a lockbox, and let the police deal with it from that point on. So what do you do if you suspect someone has a weapon? Well, if they're an ambulatory or animated type person, that is, they're not flat out or on a stretcher or something, well, you want to assess the situation and see, does your concern about them having a weapon bring the situation up to a level where you're concerned that the whole situation might be dangerous? I mean, remember, good guys have weapons too. I mean, good guys go around armed as well as bad guys. So it's not necessarily the fact they have a weapon, it's the weapon in the context of what you're viewing. So you may decide at this point, if you've decided this is a dangerous situation, you have enough concern about it, to disengage, to retreat, and to wait for the scene to be secured. And if you do that, you want to call the police, obviously, get them there if they're not already there. If they're there but not immediately present in your area, get them over to your area, tell them about your concerns, tell them you're going to stop working on this patient until the scene is secure. Or you could possibly ask them to slowly remove the weapon, or ask them if they are carrying a weapon. As I said, remember, good guys carry weapons too. If the whole scene doesn't scream danger at you, but you see someone that's exhibiting the signs and maybe carrying a gun, you might say, "Sir, are you armed?" And they might tell you, "Yeah, I have a permit, I'm armed." And if the scene doesn't get any more dangerous after that, then good, you're good to go. As I say, good people are allowed to carry weapons in this country. If you have an unanimated victim, that is maybe somebody on a stretcher, well, and you suspect they have a gun on them or some other kind of dangerous weapon, well, what does your policy say you're allowed to do at this point? Are you allowed to remove it? Must you keep it in place? What are the criteria for doing one or the other? So you need to look at your policy, see what it says, reality check your policy against what makes sense to you and what is safe on the scene. One important note here, which is if somebody has a firearm on them, somebody that can't move, somebody that's severely injured. Only remove that firearm if you know how, you really know what you're doing, and your policy allows it. Because unlike a knife or unlike a bludgeon of some kind, by removing that, you're unlikely to injure your victim farther. If you remove a firearm and you don't know what you're doing, it's possible you could accidentally pull the trigger and the gun could go off, in which case it might not just be your victim who's getting further injured, it might be you. So only remove a gun if you know what you're doing. If the situation gets to the point where someone attacks you, well, you always have a legal and a moral right to defend yourself. I mean, regardless of what your policy says, you always have a legal right to defend yourself. And the level of force you can use when you defend yourself is what's called reasonable force. Now, when we say reasonable force, it may sound like we're saying something completely obvious. But in fact, the term reasonable force is a legal concept, and it actually means something. We'll explain that in a minute. What you want to do for sure, though, is check your policy and see what it says about your ability to defend yourself. Does it even address this issue at all? I mean, if it doesn't, the rules are going to be made up after the fact, after you've had to defend yourself, and who knows what the political situation or the administrative situation is going to be at that point. So check your policy, make sure it says you're allowed to use reasonable force to defend yourself. Because if your policy doesn't say it, it doesn't exist, and who knows what will happen if you, in fact, have to fight on a call. Now, not only should your policy allow you to defend yourself using reasonable force, but your employer should indemnify you against any claims as a result of your reasonable actions. That is, if I'm on the job and a patient attacks me and I use legal and appropriate reasonable force to defend myself, I don't want to have to be personally liable for any claims that this patient is going to come after me with later. And you're always going to get sued whenever you use force. That's just a fact of life. You want your employer to indemnify you against those claims. So check your employer's insurance policy. Make sure it indemnifies you for use of force that's reasonable. And make sure your employer's policy has any riders necessary to bring that indemnity into play, speaking from experience here. If your policy doesn't allow you to defend yourself, or your employer doesn't indemnify you for actions so long as you use reasonable force, there's a good chance you're going to be held personally responsible for any claims against you. That's a very bad situation to be in for doing nothing more than what you're not just legally but morally allowed to do. In fact, morally should do. I mean, you shouldn't have to simply let yourself be attacked. Remember, if it isn't in policy, it doesn't exist. So go check what your employer has for insurance and for policy. Remember, we said that the idea of reasonable force is a legal concept and it means something? Well, what it means is that you are allowed to use the force, you are allowed to do what a reasonable person in your shoes would have done. You're allowed to use the force they would have used. And in your shoes, what that means is that that person would have had to have known what you knew about the situation and what you knew about the people present there. And this is called the reasonable man standard. And that is, your actions will be judged after the fact by the reasonable man standard. Now, it may sound like this whole idea of what's reasonable is pretty loose. And it is only to an extent, but there's really some genius to this common law concept of the reasonable man standard. And there's some genius to it because it allows your actions to be judged by the standards of the community at the time. I mean, what was a reasonable amount of force to use in a certain situation in the Old West back in the 1860s isn't going to be a reasonable amount of force to use in an urban environment today. And that's common sense. That kind of appeals to all of us these days. The whole idea of a reasonable man standard can work to your benefit in that it appeals to the common sense of the DA, who may be in a position to charge you or not, and or a jury, if God forbid, your actions wind up going to trial. So it's the reasonable man standard, what a reasonable person would have done in your place, that is the standard you'll be judged by, and and the amount of force that a reasonable person would do in your place is what you're allowed to use to defend yourself if you're under attack. What defines a reasonable amount of force is tied to the concept that your force must be proportionate. The force you use to defend yourself must be proportionate to the injury you're in fear of receiving. Now, the fear that you are in has to also be reasonable fear. It can't be an irrational fear. So just because you're afraid of this person, there has to be a darn good reason for it. But if you are reasonably in fear of a certain level of injury, you are allowed to use a certain level of response to defend yourself. Obviously, greater levels of reasonably expected injury will allow you to use greater levels of force. And note that what is a reasonable amount of force to use in a situation is tied to the injury you can expect to receive as a result of your attacker's actions, not the particular action they're taking. And the best way to explain this is that a punch from a 4-year-old kid is not the same thing as a punch from Killer Kowalski. So it's not the fact that you're being punched that allows you to use a certain level of force. It's the injury that you reasonably believe that you're going to sustain as a result of that level of force. We illustrate this concept of the proportionality between your reasonably expected injury and the level of force you're allowed to use to defend yourself on slide 54. And you can see that the level of force you're allowed to use graduates and increases from simple things like pushing somebody away to joint locks, to pepper spray, to punches and kicks, to impact weapons, all the way up to deadly force, which includes knives and guns. You're allowed to increase your level of force based on what you're in fear of. You know, if I'm only in fear of a slight bruise, then I'm probably only allowed, again, generalities here, I'm probably in most situations only allowed to maybe push this person away or use a joint lock on them. If on the other hand, I'm in fear of getting my bones broken, then I can use a much higher level of force, certainly hard punches and kicks, maybe impact weapons. And clearly, if I'm in fear of being killed or sustaining a crippling injury, then I'm allowed to use, in most jurisdictions, lethal force. That is, I can use force that I might reasonably expect might result in this person's death. If you're really curious to know in a little more detail about what kinds of force might be applicable or might be allowed in certain kinds of situations, there's a couple of sources available to you. Your local police department's use of force instructor would probably be a good resource, and also a DA or an ADA might be willing to come in to talk to you. But these people will be experts on these concepts, and because they deal with these, with this idea, and they deal with use of force every day. Whether or not you carry a specific weapon on you, whether or not you're allowed to do that on your job, there are improvised weapons, should you need one, in your environment available to you, just like they are to the bad guy. You know, we mentioned earlier that bludgeon-type weapons are available pretty much for the picking up in most environments. If you've got a liquid handy, maybe a cup of coffee, you can throw that in somebody's face, and that will buy you a second or two to maybe do something more formidable, or maybe get to a safer spot. And maybe not all, maybe not even most, but a lot of EMTs carry knives these days. And if you are at a level of attack where lethal force is justified and called for, a knife makes a very formidable lethal force weapon. So there are improvised weapons available to you in your environment, just like there are to the bad guy. If you need to use them, go ahead and use them. Most EMTs are unarmed, and so you're going to have to rely on your empty hand skills to either defeat an attacker or to get out of the situation and get to a safe spot. So empty hand skills are going to be the foundation of what you need. Even if you are carrying some sort of weapon, you're probably going to need empty hand skills in order to buy yourself the time in order to access that weapon, because many attacks, if not most attacks, are spontaneous in nature. If you didn't see it coming and you're suddenly under attack, well, you're not going to have time to access a weapon even if you were carrying one. So empty hand skills are, again, going to be necessary even if you are armed. We mentioned the knife earlier. A lot of EMTs carry knives these days as rescue tools, but it's only a lethal force weapon. It only is allowable to be used, only justifiable to use at a very high level of force, very high level of attack. I mean, the minority of attacks, in fact. So it's not all that great to rely on as a weapon, because it won't help you out in most of the kinds of attacks that you're going to come under, most of these intermediate level of attacks where people aren't really trying to kill you, they're just trying to bruise you or hurt you in some way. And even if you had to access this knife, even if it was a lethal force attack, getting to your knife, pulling it out, and opening it takes time, just like any weapon does. And so, again, you come back to empty hand skills being the necessary foundation for all self-defense. Very, very few EMTs carry firearms, and that practice is highly controversial. Pepper spray, however, is sometimes recommended to EMTs as a weapon that they can carry. I mean, it's a non-lethal weapon. It doesn't hurt people. It doesn't injure them, but it's certainly a very effective weapon. Just remember, however, if you're carrying pepper spray or it's issued to you, that when you spray somebody, particularly in a confined environment, you are also going to get sprayed. I mean, you just can't help the fact that when you discharge pepper spray in a closed environment, that some of that's going to come back at you. And now you're going to disable your attacker, but you're going to be temporarily disabled as well. So if you carry OC, a stream delivery device would probably be best. That is, an OC canister that delivers the pepper spray as a liquid stream rather than as an aerosol fog. Again, we come back to the fact that in most self-defense situations, your empty hand skills are going to be the foundation of what you do. They may be all you have time to do, but they are going to be your first line of defense in almost all cases. When you think about training in self-defense, you're thinking about training with some kind of weapon. Even if you don't think you're thinking about training with some kind of weapon, your hands and your feet and your body becomes the weapon you're training with. Now, when you think about training with weapons, including your hands and your feet, there is a way to look at it that has really kind of stood the test of time over the last bunch of decades. And they are called Ayoub's priorities. And Ayoub's priorities are named after Massad Ayoub. He's one of the best-known police instructors in the world. And he has listed the priority of things that will get you out of a situation. He's listed the priorities in which these things are important. And they are awareness. The most important thing is awareness of the situation. The second most important thing are the tactics you employ. The third most important thing is your skill with a particular weapon or technique. And the fourth most important thing, the last thing in order of priority, is what the particular weapon is that you choose to use. Drilling down a little bit into each one of those priorities, the first and most important priority is awareness. We've discussed this before, but the value of awareness should be kind of obvious. That is, you can't defend against that which you're not aware of. And in fact, if you're aware of a situation, if you're aware of what's going on around you, there's a good chance you're going to see a situation developing and be able to either shut it down or get out of there before you even have to use any kind of force. So awareness is number one. Now, also, bear in mind, I think as we mentioned before, that awareness isn't so much a skill. I mean, it's not something you can go take a class in. It's a habit. It's a habit you develop just by deciding you're going to develop it. So the old adage, the ounce of awareness is worth a pound of skill, really is true here. And awareness, if you do nothing else, practicing awareness, making awareness a habit, making yourself aware, going into condition yellow, or orange and red when necessary on every call, is what's going to save you more times than any kind of skill you develop. The second most important priority in any kind of hostile situation are the tactics you employ. And the tactics you employ are things like taking cover, moving to safety, your verbal challenges and your de-escalations, taking up a defensive position or posture, that is, rather than being bent over the patient, getting up, putting your hands in front of you, maybe getting your balance centered correctly, so if you have to fight, you can. But the tactics you employ are second in importance only to awareness. They are more important than the skills that you develop with your hands or any other weapon you're carrying. If you find yourself having to fight, the skill with which you execute a technique is generally considerably more important than the last priority, which is the technique itself or the weapon itself that's employed. You know, it's in business they say it as a mediocre strategy that's executed superbly beats a great strategy executed poorly every time. And so it doesn't really much matter whether I'm punching or kicking or throwing an elbow. It's my skill at that technique that's going to be more important than a particular technique that I'm employing. Finally, at the bottom of the list is the particular technique or weapon that you employ. Now, this is the last thing that's important. Your skill with any weapon or technique is far more important than that. Your tactics are more important than that, and your awareness, of course, is paramount in importance. But yet it's at this lowest level, ironically, it's at this lowest level, the particular thing you're doing, that so much time and energy gets eaten up. We spend a lot of time worrying, well, should I do this, should I do that, should I learn this, should I learn that? This is where different trainers spend time arguing with each other. You know, my technique is better than your technique. In fact, from your perspective, that is from a user of these techniques, just pick the techniques that appeal to you the most, appeal to your body type and the kind of coordination you have, and then get good at them, because getting good at them is much more important than the particular technique that you decide to use. A real clear example that illustrates this concept is, let's assume you had to fight with a knife. Well, you can get a lot of knife people talking about one knife is better than another, but the fact is it doesn't really matter what kind of knife you have. If it's a 2-inch knife or a 4-inch knife or an 8-inch knife, it doesn't matter what kind of knife you have. Your skill with that knife is much more important than the particular knife you're holding. And I think that that's obvious to all of us here, viewing this. The same thing applies to your self-defense techniques. It doesn't matter if you punch this way or this way. It doesn't matter if you do your joint lock this way or this way. It doesn't matter. Pick a way that you like, pick a way that appeals to you, and then get good at it. On the subject of awareness, sometimes we're wending our way through some kind of building, and we're not really sure what's around another corner or not. I mean, it could be we're in this gray area where, you know, we hope there's nothing bad going on here, but we're not really sure, but we decided to go ahead anyway. There is a way to take corners safely, or as safely as possible, so that you just don't go around a corner and wind up running into a bad guy intent on hurting you. And for instance, take a look at slide 64. Here you are going merrily along your way and with a stretcher and heading for your patient, and you got this bad guy around the corner waiting for you, wanting you to do some harm. Well, how could you see him before he sees you? There is a way to do this. Well, there is a technique you can use for going around corners so that you can see the danger that might be lurking around a corner as soon as possible. This technique is called slicing the pie. And the first thing to know about it is that you don't want to take corners closely. That is, let's say the corner of this door here is my corner that I'm going around. Rather than walk around this corner here like this, where I'm taking the corner very tight, what I want to do is I want to get as far away as I can from this corner and take it as widely as possible. The second thing to know about this technique is, as I start to go around this corner, every time I step a little bit, another little piece of the pie opens up for me to see into. And that's where the term slicing the pie comes from. As I go around this corner, I look around every little slice as I go around. Whether I'm going around fast or slow doesn't matter. It's just as I go around, I'm actively looking into every little slice as it comes into view. And you can see this illustrated on slide 66. Where we've got the lines drawn so you can see what part of around the corner you can see into as you and the stretcher are going around. And here on slide 67, you can see what the bad guy would see if he was looking at that corner. He would only see a little bit of your head coming around that corner. And you could see all of him because your eye is around that corner. Now, he might even miss you if he's not looking closely for someone coming around that corner exactly at that moment. So the point here is you're only exposing a little bit of yourself, and you can see all of him. And this gives you the maximum possible advantage when you go around corners. So if you're in some kind of environment that's in this gray area, it could potentially be dangerous, but you decided to go to the patient anyway, and you want to take corners as safely as possible, just take them wide, and in your mind, slice the pie. That is, look into each slice of what's around the corner as it becomes available to you. Obviously, if you see something bad there, stop, go to plan B. Probably one of the worst things that could happen to you on a call is you get caught in some kind of gunfire. Well, if you hear gunfire, obviously you're going to stop working and you need to get yourself behind something that's safe. You need to take cover. The important distinction to remember here is that cover actually stops bullets. Bullets won't go through cover. Concealment just shields you from the view of the shooter. So it's important to understand the difference between cover and concealment, and when you're seeking cover, to actually get behind some kind of cover. Most cover is going to be something like masonry, something really solid. If you're trying to take cover behind a car or a truck, remember that most parts of a car or truck won't stop bullets. They're mere concealment. The engine block on most cars and trucks, most light trucks, is about the only thing that's going to really stop a bullet. But if you hear gunfire, the thing to do is get behind cover. Find some cover, get behind it. So since typically gunfire is probably going to erupt outside and we're going to be looking for cover outside, we're probably going to lock on to that car or maybe even our own truck to get behind. So just bear in mind that if you really want cover, try to get behind the engine block. Even on your own rig, most parts of it aren't going to stop too many bullets. Certainly not most rifle rounds, and even most handgun rounds could probably easily sail right through it. So if you're banking on a vehicle of some kind as your cover, look for the engine block. As you look for cover from gunfire, should you be so unfortunate to have to do that, also bear in mind the concept of skipped, or phenomena of skipped bullets. You know, we all learned in high school physics class that angle of incidence equals angle of reflection. And that works fine with rubber balls. It doesn't work with bullets necessarily. If a bullet hits a solid wall, something like masonry, at a narrow angle, or the ground at a narrow angle, instead of bouncing off of it, that is, instead of bouncing off, what it will do is it will come in, hit the wall or the ground, and then just continue along, just inches from it, at a high rate of speed. So if you are hunkered down on the ground or behind some kind of solid wall at a narrow angle to the potential gunfire, just realize that you may actually be in the line of fire, even though maybe you can't see the shooter. So long as that shooter can hit the wall or the ground that you're on or behind at a narrow angle, that bullet can skip right along and hurt you. So you may not have a choice as to where you seek cover, but to the extent you do, this is something to be aware of. Therefore, if gunfire starts to occur around you, hitting the dirt may not be the best option. I mean, it may be if you don't have anywhere else to go. It's better to be on the ground probably than standing out in the open. But be aware that by hitting the dirt, you could be susceptible to skip bullets. So a very brief amount of time, and by that I mean less than a second, spent quickly looking around for the best genuine cover that's available may be time well spent in this kind of situation. Now this concludes the classroom part of this program. Next we're going to move into the training hall. We're going to show you some defensive moves that you can use that will hopefully come in handy for you should you be assaulted on the job.